Welcome. I'm Kimberly Enger. I serve as the Dean of the Dorothy and Bill Cohen Honors College and as faculty in the English department. I'm delighted to have so many students with us today, as well as faculty, friends, and some members of the community. So we are here today with two special guests who are going to talk about the state of play in current politics. It's a very timely topic. It's something that's on everyone's mind, and they're going to give us, I think, some information to grapple with, and then we're going to open it up for questions and answers. So we're going to have a good amount of time for discussion, and at the very end, we'll stop a few minutes early, and those folks who are here have the opportunity to win a little bit of college swag. So there's an incentive. If you stay to the end, you have to be here to win your college swag. So thanks to Professor Amos and Professor Allen, and we look forward to the state of play in current politics.
Okay, thank you. So hello, everybody. I am Neil Allen. I am a professor of political science and chair of the political science department here at Wichita State University. And also I am the law and public policy minor advisor for the Honors College. And I'm joined by my colleague, Brian Amos. Brian, could you say hello?
Hi, yeah, I'm Dr. Amos. I'm an assistant professor in the political science department.
And also, assistant professor just means that he started fairly recently. It doesn't mean that he is an assistant or anything like that. Actually, I'm an associate now, which means I don't just assist professors. I can like be their friends and things. Someday I'll be a full professor, maybe. So what we're going to do today is talk a bit about the competitiveness of politics, both in Kansas in general. Now, we are part of the United States of America, but our place in the presidential election is somewhat less important than others because we're not so competitive on the federal level. But what we're going to do is basically talk about the competitiveness of Kansas and local politics, starting with the presidential level, then going to the U.S. Senate, U.S. House, and then talking about the state legislature. And then after we're done with the particular somewhat prepared part of our presentation, then we can have a general discussion where people can ask about general area competitiveness of general districts generally across the state, or we can talk about the presidential election or whatever else. We could even possibly, if anybody wants to, talk about the two weird debate-like events that happened in the last couple of weeks, but which probably don't have a lot to do with competitiveness, but are still interesting in themselves. All right, so what Professor Amos has done is brought up a website, 538.com, and their politics site. And we're going to use that to talk about the races that they are handicapping this year and forecasting, and then move to some maps taking a look at state legislative elections. So here, and just to give you a brief idea what 538 is it's a data journalism site. It's named 538 because that's the number of electoral votes in our system in America. And just note that in the United States, we do not have a direct election for president. We have this thing called the Electoral College, which in effect is a point system where every state gets a certain amount of points and the candidate who wins the most points wins. We in Kansas, for example, get 6 points out of 538. And so the modelers at 538 do a lot of very complex statistical analysis using historical data, polls, and other kinds of data to try to figure out what their guess is as to who wins or loses the next election. Note here they have President Donald Trump as only a 15% chance of winning the presidency, with Joe Biden, the Democrat, as having 85%. But we should note here that things that happen only 15% of the time happen all the time. Like more or less 15% of the days of the week are Saturday. You know, even the worst baseball player in the major leagues will get a hit 15% of the time. And also, we have all kinds of examples of upsets in American politics. And so, Professor Amos, if you can move on to Kansas, if you could. And so so here in beautiful, flat Kansas, we have not voted for a Democrat for president since 1964. And there's several states that have that distinction, like us and Wyoming and Utah and Idaho. That was the last big giant Democratic landslide. Uh, but it is somewhat notable that using what little polls there are out there and national polls, 538 thinks there's some chance of the Democrats winning a victory in Kansas. That 7%, which isn't a terribly large amount. And Professor Amos, if you could go back and if you could show me the snake on the tipping point snake. So one thing to note about the Electoral College is what really matters here is getting to 270. And the way 538 likes to describe this is this kind of snake of competitiveness. So right now, Pennsylvania is the most likely state to be the tipping point state, which means they're right in the middle and give one candidate or other their 270th electoral vote. Now note that there's a few states that seem to be more Democratic than the tipping point, and that the Democrat Joe Biden is probably, projected to win not just 270, which he needs for a victory, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 350 or so. But note here where Kansas sits. Kansas is not the most Republican state in the country. It's pretty far from it. There's several states that will likely vote where Donald Trump will have a much stronger chance of winning than Kansas. Kansas is about the most the state that's the most Republican the Democrats have any shot in. But also it is notable that in the last 20 or so years, particularly in the last 10, Kansas has moved a little bit toward the Democrats relative to the national average. And that seems to be both because Kansas was historically Republican in certain parts of the state, like around Johnson County, were kind of more Republican they probably should have been just because of historical voting patterns. And also in Kansas, we have a relatively educated population compared to the nation, and educated voters, particularly white educated voters, like having college degrees, tend to be moving toward the Democrats. And so the relatively educated parts of the state, and particularly around Johnson County and Lawrence, have been moving very fast toward the Democrats. There's been a small movement in rural areas toward the Republicans, but even around Wichita, which is not a terribly liberal place, you can see some move to the Democrats in wealthy suburban areas, like particularly Northeast Wichita. So if we go on further our journey down the ballot, if we take a look at the states, at the U.S. Senate. Now this is probably the most interesting race in Kansas, and certainly the one that's gotten the most attention. We have tens of millions of dollars being spent on television and other kinds of advertising for this race. Some of that has to do with the fact that the Democrats have raised so much money nationwide that they can spend it in a lot of places. But also this Barbara Boyer is probably the best Senate candidate the Democrats have had in a generation. And also you get so much advertising, like my kids are even complaining that when they want to go see YouTube videos, they have to watch a Barbara Boyer ad or something like that. But 538, and I think they're right on this, still has Boyer as an underdog. Having lived here in Kansas and paid some attention to things, I think Boyer might have a little better chance than this. Her advertising seems to be pretty good. Roger Marshall, who kind of looks like your standard Republican candidate, had to have a very difficult primary where there was a lot of money spent against him. And also he's tied to President Trump, who is getting less and less popular, it looks like, nationwide. And Boyer will probably run ahead of the Democratic candidate for President Joe Biden. But unless Biden gets in the kind of mid-40s in Kansas, then I think Boyer will have a real hard time winning. But she's certainly gotten a lot of attention, and this is the best the Democrats have run in Kansas in quite some time. Although the negative for her is, unlike Laura Kelly, our current governor, she doesn't get to run against Chris Kobach, which is probably the most unpopular Republican in modern times in Kansas, who used to be our Secretary of State. And also, there isn't a major third-party candidate on the ballot for Kansas this fall for Senate. There is a Libertarian who will help Boyer by siphoning off a little bit of Marshall's vote, but she's probably going to have to get to something like 48, 49% to win, and that's a long way to go for a Democrat, but there is a shot this year. So also in Kansas, like every other state, we have U.S. House districts, and 538 thankfully even has prediction models for those. And also one note here, what 538 does is they run a lot of different simulations of elections. And so each of those circles is a simulation. And for them, they find that every time they run 100, then in this district, the second, it goes to the Republicans. The second district is a pretty interesting district. It includes Topeka and Lawrence, which are pretty Democratic areas. At least Lawrence is strongly Democratic. And then pretty much everything in the eastern quarter of the state, except for the Kansas City metro core area. That means Pittsburgh and all kinds of other places in southeast Kansas. This is an area that Governor Kelly won at the gubernatorial level, but by a small amount, but Democrats have been losing votes in on southeast Kansas. The Democrats have a pretty good candidate, Michelle de la Isla, who is the mayor of Topeka. Republicans have the current state treasurer, Jake LaTurner, who looks like he's the favorite. He actually won a primary that was contested because the incumbent Republican, Steve Watkins, has various scandal problems, including registering to vote at a UPS store, which is not, you're not allowed to do that. So nobody do that. You only get to register to vote where you're actually living. So for many students, you do have a choice where you can register. You can, if you're living in Shocker Hall, you can register to vote there. If you come from someplace that is not Wichita, you can register to vote there. Just don't register both places and vote twice because that's illegal. Even though almost no one ever does that. So in Kansas, this looks like the most competitive U.S. House district is the second. Now the third district is interesting because that is the one district where a Democrat holds right now. Sharice Davids is the first Democrat to hold a U.S. House district in Kansas in 10 years. She won a close but clear victory over a Republican 2 years ago. U.S. House seats all have 2-year terms. And the Republican has a 10% chance of winning. This district was about evenly divided 4 years ago for president, but it's been moving pretty heavily toward the Democrats. It includes Johnson County and then Kansas City. And so it is notable that a year after, if we go back 2 years or more, the Republicans look pretty strong there, and now that district isn't terribly competitive. Now, Professor Ames, I don't know if we can find the fourth district, which may not be actually on there. And this is where we live. So most of the voters in this district are in the Wichita metro area, although it does include some lightly populated areas both to the east and west. 538 thinks the Democratic candidate, Laura Lombard, has virtually zero chance here. This is a district that the Democrats have really not been competitive in any election except for the special election for this district in April of 2017. Those of us that lived around here remember that as the first special election after President Trump was elected. And that was actually a pretty close election. But also there'll probably be maybe 1 or 2 districts nationwide that seem like that are totally uncompetitive that the Democrats will win this time. And it could be this one possibly. And Lombard is running a serious campaign and has a campaign staff and is running it, and has been raising a small amount of money. So, and that's not just important for this race. So running candidates are important across the board because the Democrats are competitive for Senate, if not some other places too. So that's what we look like on the U.S. House level. So Professor Amos, could you go to the U.S. House map? And forgive us if we have some technical back and forth. We haven't actually done this particular kind of shtick before. So this is the U.S. House map. Notice we're in Congressional District 4. Congressional District 1, or sometimes called the Big First, includes more cows than people, I think. Includes about 2/3 of the state's population, and is notable because it's actually an area that has basically the same amount of population in it as it did like in 1890. Which is fairly rare in the United States. That was basically because there was so much rain in the 1870s and 1880s. People thought that they could grow crops and have settlement patterns just like they did back like where I'm from in Indiana, but it didn't work that way. Although the folks that have hung on long enough to get irrigation and oil then do pretty well. The second and third are on the border of being competitive this year. Although some of these lines at least will have to be changed for the next House elections because we're having a census, so that means we have to change to make sure that they're all equal population. And so, Professor Amos, you want to move to the state legislative map, and then also can you go ahead and get the precinct vote up? And then why don't I turn it over to you for just the general idea of districting and also what the the partisan breakdown statewide looks like.
Sure. So I guess the first thing is, what are you looking at here? So this is a map of all of the voting precincts in the state. This is part of a project I've been working on, the voting and election science team. Getting the results at this level is pretty straightforward, but actually getting the geography can be a pain. Kansas is relatively good on this, but other states that we've been working on have been a real problem. But you can see a few things going on here. So obviously the kind of western, more rural regions are more Republican. So this is colored as you would expect. The deeper reds are more Republican. The deeper blue are more Democratic. And this is specifically the Kelly Kobach 2018 gubernatorial election. And another thing you might notice, or it might be a little tough to tell actually, is that out west we have these big kind of nice squares for precincts. And we can zoom into Wichita in particular, and we get smaller pieces of geography. You can see these big squares outside of the city, but as we move in, we essentially get neighborhoods or sub-neighborhoods going on here. And that's because we try to get some sort of balance in population between precincts. It doesn't have to be exact, but you have to think in terms of, well, each of these will probably have their own polling place. How much can those polling places handle? So these big ones tend to be entire townships in rural areas. And again, as we move into the cities, we get kind of neighborhood level polling places. You can notice another trend here though. These denser areas tend to be more blue. And going back to kind of the state snapshot, these more rural, bigger areas tend to be more red. So again, this is a map of Kelly versus Kobach. And if you just saw this map, you might say, there's a lot more red going on here than blue. Therefore, Kobach probably, swept this election real easily, but obviously not. We have Governor Kelly. So this is one of the issues we've seen at the national level where Republicans won more counties than Democrats did. But again, Clinton won the popular vote. This is an issue when we get to redistricting. As Dr. Allen mentioned before, we're currently conducting a census. Actually, we might be finishing today, depending on how courts rule, but if not, at the end of the month. And then next year, we'll be getting the new counts of where people live across the state and across the country. And from there, the state legislature will have to redraw the lines you see in front of you. So currently, these are the state Senate lines. And one of the major rules is that these have to be roughly equal population. I actually have projections for the county level here. So going from 2010 to 2019, how has population changed across the state? And the tan, orange type counties are ones that have lost population. So these are absolute numbers. So the lightest tan have just barely lost a little bit of population, and the lightest blue have gained a little bit of population. But you can see the KC area, especially Johnson County, by far has grown the most. Sedgwick has grown quite a bit. Douglas has grown quite a bit as well. So when we think about where these lines are going to change, again, we have to balance out these populations as they've changed over the decade. We're going to see more state house districts and state senate districts in Johnson County, and maybe an extra state house district in Sedgwick, for instance, or at least more parts of districts within that area. So again, that is a process that we'll be dealing with in this state. We'll be getting that data in the middle of next year, and then the legislature will take it on in early 2022. And actually, we here in the political science department are offering a class in the fall of 2021 where we'll be actually playing with the census data and drawing districts in Kansas, and hopefully presenting the maps that we draw to the state legislature for consideration. And there should be some honor college seats in that class as well. Yeah, Dr. Allen, do you want to talk about what the map actually looks like right now?
Sure, and why don't we stay with the Zoom, do the Kansas Senate and zoom in around Wichita. And one thing that's nice about Wichita that I wasn't, and Kansas in general, I wasn't necessarily expecting when I moved here, was how competitive elections actually are. So I moved from a place in Minnesota where Minnesota has very competitive elections. It's nearly evenly divided on the presidential level. The state legislature has switched back and forth between Republicans and Democrats several times in recent years. But Kansas is a little different. And from the outside, you might think that we are monolithically Republican. It doesn't really, our elections don't necessarily matter except in Republican primaries. But one thing about Kansas is we have a fairly vibrant, moderate Republican tradition. And moderate Republicans here tend to coalition with Democrats on certain issues and conservatives on other issues. And that situation means that there's competitive elections in Republican primaries where, for example, moderates have done well, like in 2016. Conservatives did well just this year in 2020, and especially in the state house and really in the state Senate. But also that Democrats, our Democrats are clearly the minority party. They really don't have a path to getting a majority in either house of the state legislature, but they are competitive in lots of seats. And also importantly is they're right on the edge of having more than a third in both the state house and the state Senate, which is extremely important for two reasons. One is that they can block constitutional amendments from going to the voters. We saw last year there was an attempt to put an amendment called the Value Them Both Amendment onto the state ballot for this year, which would be to put an abortion ban into the state constitution. That passed in the Senate because the Republicans had a 2/3 majority, but narrowly failed in the House because the Democrats had have enough to block there. And those thresholds are up for election this year, and it's because of how many state districts are competitive. What Professor Amos is showing here is the map around Wichita. These are state Senate districts, so we have 40 of them. So that means roughly, so there's 3 million or so people in Kansas, so that means the state Senate districts are probably something like 85,000 people. So much smaller than US House districts, but still a significant number of people. Here in the Wichita area, we have two that are currently Democratic. As you can see, the 29th district is where we sit right now. I'm in Lindquist Hall. Professor Amos is down the hall for me in Lindquist Hall, although we are of course Zooming, so we'll look like we're for different places. But where we are sitting right now is in the 29th district that is represented by Senator Olathe Faust-Godot. This is one of the most Democratic areas in the state. It is only a minority, is one of the few districts in the state on the state Senate level that are minority white. And also it has the majority of the city's African-American population, majority of its Latino population, at least a strong plurality of it, and also a good chunk of other neighborhoods that are white majority but tend to vote more for Democrats. In particular, Riverside is part of Riverside is in that neighborhood, this district, as well as where I live near College Hill, which has been trending pretty heavily Democratic. It is notable that the 25th district it's a little less Democratic, but this is a district that the Republicans held at the state Senate level as recently as the 2012 elections. But now the Democrats won it in 2016, have an appointed incumbent in there, Mary Ware, because she took over for Lieutenant Governor Rogers when he was elected. But it looks like that one's total Democrats are solid there. But there are two other state Senate districts that take in good chunks of the city of Wichita. Both of them look to be competitive. The 30th to the east is very interesting. That's a district that is held currently by Susan Wagle. She is the #1 Republican in the state Senate, probably the most important antagonist of Governor Kelly. And she is resigning. And then just not running for re-election. Democrats have a good shot there, and as well as they do in the 28th, which is the district that has a very conservative incumbent, Mike Peterson. But the Democrats have a candidate, Jim Ward, who's a state House member. They look like they have a good shot there. And so, and also, we won't look at the actual districts unless people have questions. But there are several districts around the northeast part of the state that are competitive between the two parties. One of them, Governor Kelly's old district around Topeka, the Republicans could conceivably win. And also the Democrats have a chance of picking up maybe as many as 5 districts around. Because part of it is because the Democrats had a really bad year in 2016. They tended to put the resources in the wrong places and lost all the close seats. but they've got a good shot this year. And they've got a couple of retirements around Kansas City that are going to be helpful to them. And this is really important because if the Democrats get up to 14 or 15, they can block constitutional amendments, sustain Governor Kelly's vetoes, and also if they get to that level with moderates, they may have a chance to push through Medicaid expansion, which they were about 2 votes shy of last time. And on the state house level, Professor Amos, you could go to that particular map. Things look somewhat similar. Notice here that Democrats are pretty strong in the city of Wichita. Now, it wasn't that long ago that a couple of these districts were Republican, but I just want to note a couple of districts that are interesting around. One, we're in the 84th right now, which is Gail Finney's district. She's an African-American Democrat who's been in the legislature for over a decade. This is one of the few times she has a Republican opponent. That just means that she might only get 90% of the vote instead of 100%. But it does matter to have candidates on the ballot, just if nothing else, to get your votes out from your supporters so that they can help in other races. And it is notable that the Republicans have a candidate in every single race in Sedgwick County. And the Democrats nearly do as well. But a couple of districts are notable as showing how the Wichita area is going in different directions. So the 96th district, which is noticed kind of to the south and southwest part of Wichita, that was held by Mayor Brandon Whipple until recently. There's an appointed Democratic incumbent in there, Stephanie Yeager. This is probably close to a 50-50 district. If we go back, let's say 10 years ago, this would be more of a strong Democratic area. But the collapse, or at least the decline of the aircraft industry, meant the decline of the unions. Working class white voters have been moving away from the Democratic Party. So this is an area where I'd have to look it up again, but I think Donald Trump won by about 15 percentage points in that area. It was actually notable that Whipple was able to win a re-election in 16, even when the party wins were against him. But if we look at the 83rd district over in the northeast part of the city, actually we meant the 87th. This is a district where Democrats have really never put up much of a fight, that Republicans have been very strong because these are very kind of suburban conservative voters. But this is the kind of voter that has been moving more to the Democratic Party, where the kind of voter that's the majority up in Johnson County. But even here in Wichita, you're seeing some movement here, and so the Democrats might have a chance in the 87th. Although it is somewhat notable also because the Republican candidate is Susan Estes, who is the wife of Ron Estes, our congressman, which probably helps her in the district. But it's not often that you have a husband-wife team that are actually representing their constituents in different legislative bodies. But we still see there'll be several districts around Wichita that'll probably be competitive. Likely we'll still say with a similar kind of map. But the Democrats right now have 41, which is just barely enough to block anything with some other Republican allies. So every vote counts, and this will be like the second time I encourage everybody to register and vote, because around here in Kansas, at least, pretty much everybody, no matter where you live, has some vote that matters for a competitive election this fall. So we've talked a little while. So why don't we do it this way? Professor Amos, you want to stop the sharing? We'll go back to the full group, and then why don't we do if anybody has any questions about any particular race, or we can talk about politics in general. No question is too stupid a question. We can even talk about flies on the vice president's head if you want. And if you don't know what I mean, you didn't endure the VP debate last night. But if anybody has a question or a comment, you can either put them in the chat, or you can raise your blue hand, or raise your actual hand if you so desire. And I'll call on people and we'll have a discussion. And by raise your blue hand, I mean go to the participants tab and find the blue hand and raise it. Although I'm thinking everybody here has probably done 15 million Zooms, but you never know.
Thank you, Professor Amos and Professor Allen. I actually want to interject with a question for people to put into the chat. And this is somewhat related to to your presentation, but I'm really curious to know if people would put into the chat, where do you get your news about politics? And you could have multiple news sources. This is really just a curiosity question to get a sense. So if you're willing to enter into that chat box, where is it that you listen to or get news about politics? Could be friends, Facebook. The Skim, I don't know that.
So while people are putting some stuff there, I'll talk about Nora Malone's question. Nora is a fabulous student in my first year seminar class on the election. Nora said, class Dr. Amos mentioned about using census data. What other things will we do besides drawing the districts? Professor Amos, you want to talk about that?
Sure. So a good chunk of it will be hands-on, actually working with the data. We'll learn a little bit about, I guess, the software you saw me working with, but a good, probably bigger half of it will be the theoretical side of things. So a historical look at redistricting and gerrymandering. Gerrymandering as a term is over 200 years old at this point. But then like modern theories of, does gerrymandering actually matter? Are people naturally sorted? I already showed you that Democrats tend to live in cities. That might lead to inefficiencies on how they get districted. So there's a lot of literature on how important redistricting and gerrymandering is, and we'll learn a little bit about that. But you'll also get the hands-on experience of, well, we could probably make gerrymandering matter with the maps we draw. We're going to be able to draw some wacky Kansas maps to disenfranchise some people. So yeah.
And also one note, it's one reason why we're wanting to have a redistricting class. It's not just because we have Professor Amos, who is an expert and actually has been consulting for both Republican and Democratic parties and different places in the country involving litigation, because redistricting always leads to people suing all the time, particularly because the Supreme Court is unwilling to say anything clear about redistricting. And so everybody has to guess and keep having state action. But also because it's just a place where race and other kinds of geography comes in. Not as much gender, because the population of men and women is pretty much uniformly distributed across the country. Alaska's got a little bit more men than women, but on issues of race, issues of geography, and rural, urban, it all comes together. And also we're somewhat unique in America that we let the politicians, for the most part, draw their own maps, which is kind of like letting the players decide the rules of the game and letting the players who've won draw new rules so they can win even more. But it's fun to talk about and think about. Let's see, we have a whole lot of actually I noticed here we have someone mentioned, so from Cameron H. Cameron says, looks at Reuters, online, local news, don't follow Kansas politics that much, focus more on Montana politics. Still voted Montana. Montana is actually really interesting. Montana is a state that elects one Democrat for the Senate. The other seat is actually competitive now. The Democratic governor, Steve Bullock, is a pretty solid candidate, might pick off that seat from the Republican. Democrats might take the U.S. House seat back. Also, Montana is interesting on the issue of the census because depending on how the census works out, Montana might actually get a district back. So they lost, they went from 2 districts to 1 back in 1990 because the depopulation of the Great Plains meant that Montana's population was growing so slowly that their proportion was cut in half. But now the big growth of hippies and others wanting to move to mountain locations where it's pretty and snowy means that Montana's on the edge of actually getting back one of their congressional seats, which doesn't happen very often. Kansas, we're not going to get our 5th back, or our 6th, or our 7th, or our 8th. And there's a chance 10 years from now we're going to lose our 4th. But all of you can stay here and you have massively successful businesses and jobs and attract so many people here that you will then help us keep our 4 congressional districts and make lots of money and give money to the Cohen Honors College. But that's in the future. We have some other stuff here. Lynette Murphy said, I'm interested in Dr. Allen's comment regarding more educated people becoming more progressive liberal over time. I definitely find to be the case personally. Why is that? Professor Amos, you want to start? What looks to be behind the movement of more educated people in terms of college becoming more Democrat? As I understand, that tends to be concentrated mostly among whites because there isn't a lot of variation on other variables much at all among non-whites, which tend to lean more Democratic.
And we definitely have seen it like 2016 and since in suburban white kind of educated areas. So Johnson County is sort of the image of where this is happening. We've seen it to a certain extent in the Midwest. Like the Orlando suburbs was a big turning point in Florida, those kind of wealthier white suburbs. I mean, if you talk about educated people living in city cores, those were already very blue. So it does seem to be maybe not purely educational. There might be another dimension interacting with it to get the trend we're seeing.
Yeah, and actually, if you want to find one variable that helps to predict somebody's vote, ask them, would you rather live in a more dense environment where you can walk to amenities, or would you rather have a big yard? And that tends to predict with the people like density voting more Democratic and people like less dense environments voting more Republican. And that's not necessarily all about politics, but that's one of the reasons why we're sorting more and more into different groups. I mean, it seems, and it's not really about wanting certain amenities. Like it used to be that, for example, places around a Starbucks will be very Democratic, but that really isn't true anymore, that there's Starbucks everywhere. But also, it seems to be there. It may be that going to college actually changes people's minds about different matters in terms of tolerance of other views. Certainly on issues like climate change, there is a difference between the two parties in their respect for science, and that probably has a little bit to do with the difference between the groups. Also, this income works a little bit different between the parties because people who have higher education tend to have higher incomes. That has tended to drive them to being more Republican. But since our politics are often more cultural these days, and that in some ways, I don't know if it necessarily helps the Democrats, because I think it does with more educated people, because educated people tend to be more like the Democrats on issues. But also, if you take away or minimize the economic issues involving taxation in particular, then you take away one of the Republicans' big advantages. And we should note, if we go back far enough, if you go back to, let's say, to 1981, before the Reagan tax cuts, there were people paying 70% on taxes on income they made over a certain level. Now, not very many people actually paid that because there are various kind of tax shelters and deductions you could use to get out of it. But the differences between the highest tax rates and the lower tax rates were so massive that it made sense for people to actually vote on their pocketbook in the way they don't necessarily anymore. Although the Democrats are starting to get support, at least within their own party, for really high rates of taxation again. So like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is probably the most important young Democrat, probably I would say the most important voice for progressive ideas inside the Democratic Party, with the possible exception of Bernie Sanders. She has talked about getting us more back to the pre-1980s tax rates on those that are very wealthy. And if we get back to the point where more than half of somebody's money they make over, let's say, $500,000 or $200,000 is going to taxes, then especially people that are like lawyers and doctors might start to swing the other direction. Unlike we college professors, because we don't make that much money. We've got upper class levels of education and middle class levels of pay, and we pass that savings on to you. So let me look I'm going to look in the chat. If anybody has any questions they want to raise their blue hand for, go ahead.
There is a related question, I think, maybe, and this might be more for Professor Amos, so we could take them maybe in reverse order. The question from Haley: do you think there is truly a way to make gerrymandering fair?
Well, this is a good reason to take my class because you can spend weeks on this. I mean, the first question is, what is fair redistricting? How do you define that? And maybe the most basic way to do that is if you get the most votes, you get the most seats. And I didn't show it, but actually here in Kansas, Governor Kelly won just a bare majority of both state House and state Senate seats. And she won, just a majority of the votes. So you might think that Kansas's districts are fair, and that's a product of Republicans were in control of the process 10 years ago, but they weren't able to pass their own maps where you would expect maybe a gerrymander. Instead, the courts drew them. And we tend to see if neutral actors are drawing those lines, either through the courts doing it. Some states have independent redistricting commissions where either like the judicial branch chooses people to be on this board, or some external group chooses who gets to draw the lines. That usually results in something fairer. We can measure fairness in a lot of different ways, but I think ultimately putting people whose jobs aren't on the line with the outcome of these districts. I mean, state legislators draw their own districts, so it's hard to keep them from drawing districts that they're going to win. That would be my preferred way of doing things. We're seeing that spread for the past couple decades across more states.
And so, Dean Ingber, you seem to say you picked out a different question to ask as well.
Yeah, so the one then that I skipped was Nicole's question. And this could, I think, be for either or both of you. How much do attack ads actually hurt a candidate? So for example, do you think the ads against Bollier or De La Isla are impacting the races significantly?
And also, I should note here, in full disclosure, Nicole, you want to say which candidate you've been working for a little while?
Yeah, I did a lot of work with Michelle De La Isla over the summer.
Right, and I just say that also because you mentioned attack ads on them. Since I don't get Topeka or Pittsburgh television or Kansas City television, I haven't seen what advertising looks like in terms of De La Isla and LaTurner, although I do get media for the state here in Wichita. And yes, Boyer's getting hit pretty hard, but also Marshall's getting hit pretty hard too. And also Boyer's has more money actually on her side, which is the idea of a Kansas Democrat having a spending advantage just still seems crazy to me to say. But Act Blue is a powerful thing. And aggregates lots of Democratic money from nationwide into competitive races. It also takes lots of money and takes it over to Kentucky to try to run against Mitch McConnell, and that's equivalent of taking money and turning into cash and lighting it on fire. But not all money follows competitiveness. But as far as attack ads, the literature, I think, is pretty divided about what actually tends to work. Often contrast ads can be effective. A lot of it depends on whether the campaigns can craft a narrative that people believe. The idea here, if you just look at the Boyer campaign, certainly the Marshall campaign, and particularly there's more money coming in on national groups that are connected, like the Senate Leader McConnell. They're trying to push a narrative that Boyer is just another Democratic liberal, and looking at her vote record and trying to blunt the fact that she has a fairly small record as an elected politician and that she's a former Republican, which she's trying to talk about. And it is notable that I get more news and ads on radio because I actually listen to radio over the air because I'm a middle-aged man who has the media habits of an old man. But Boyer's ads sound like Republican ads, and they particularly taken men who have kind of stereotypically rural accents and ways of speaking, endorsing Boyer. And that's probably an effective way to combat negative ads. But also some of it is, if the Republicans could have, a Bob Dole quality candidate to run, they would, but they don't really in Marshall, but they do have enough money, so they try to push their ideas that way. Professor Remus, what do you think about negative ads? I know this is a little bit outside of your research area, but I know you're teaching parties and elections right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's a noisy thing to measure. I mean, you can, first of all, you have to decide whether an ad is negative or positive, or yeah, contrast ad. I mean, we're already seeing this, I guess, with Biden announcing he's taking down all of his negative ads. You know, was he being negative at his rallies by saying things that Trump is doing in a negative way, or is that just a contrast between their records? And there's also the issue of, you know, when does a candidate deploy negative ads? Is that a sign of desperation, in which case maybe they're already doing poor? And, you know, making like a statistical model where you take all of this into account can be difficult, which is maybe why the literature is also kind of noisy on what the true effect of this is. I mean, the alternative is you could do sort of a lab experiment, like a psychology type experiment, but then you run into results of, do these results apply outside of the lab experience? Yeah, so again, not my real area of expertise, but yeah.
And one thing I should note is that that it's not a simple relationship between spending money and vote share. So that often actually the candidates that spend the most money are often losers, partly because they're actually sometimes amateurs or people that are extremely wealthy that have some fringe views. And that money tends to actually, incumbents raise a lot of money, so people who are in office already, but their money tends to be most effective at scaring candidates away from running against them. But whenever races actually get going, often the amount of money that that the challenger raises is most important and spends, because that allows them to define themselves and possibly to say negative things about their opponent, because people tend to understand and know things about incumbents more. And also one interesting note on money, this wasn't what you asked, but it's probably relevant because we have female candidates running for things here in Kansas. Like the Democrats have all 4 U.S. House candidates are female. The Senate candidate is female, and then there's 1 female candidate on the Republican side for U.S. House. But women running for office tend to actually raise more than men running for office. And that might be counterintuitive because men actually have jobs where they make more money. They tend to have social networks where they're more connected to wealthy people. But it's partly because women need to have more money to think that they're able to run. They need to have, and so women tend to take longer to decide that they're a quality candidate. It's time to run, and they also feel like they need to have more money and work harder to raise money when they're running for things. You know, just like it's a job like any other, and women, you know, tend to think that. I think there's actually been some studies that have found that, with general qualifications, women tend to apply for promotions or jobs when they feel like they have 100% of the qualifications, and men just need 60%. And that's true also in politics. Although saying that might be a little stale on the Democratic side, because there's so many women running for office as Democrats. And we certainly see it around here around Wichita. They're probably not going to win, but you have several female Democrats running for countywide office, where the Democrats traditionally haven't paid much attention in years. You have lots of state House candidates. You have U.S. House candidates. The Democrats in the U.S. House level are actually, they're no longer majority white male. I think they'll probably be majority female after this election cycle. And so that really says something about our particular politics right now. And also it doesn't seem like that women are actually disadvantaged running for office. And if anything, if you looked at it last night with the VP debate, even up against a very accomplished and steady politician in Vice President Pence, Kamala Harris seemed to do very well, and most polling tends to show that as well, which certainly shows that we've made a certain amount of progress in our particular country. So I think, so I just noting in the chat, Dean Ingber asked to talk about what news sources you go to. This is an honors college educated crowd, so we get a lot of NPR. I noted a couple people said Twitter. Actually, Twitter can be really good. Twitter is actually a good place to connect to authors, particularly authors whose writing is behind a paywall normally. So like I no longer subscribe to The Atlantic, but I can follow lots of people on Twitter. It's also good to get up-to-date information. And also a lot of reporters more or less just report out their reporter's notes. But my line is Twitter is a good place to read other people's stuff, but actually saying things on Twitter is a good way to get yourself in trouble because there's all kinds of stuff in my head that I could write in 30 seconds and then it would actually not be a good thing for me in the future, particularly considering my potty mouth needs not to be typed out, as any of you know if you had me in class before. But before we end up and have prizes, do we have any further questions anybody wants to ask? Well, this seems to work like a class. So whenever I ask that, nobody asks any questions. So that's all right. So Dean Ingber, you want to go with however you do the super fabulous drawing?
Yes, so it's time for the super fabulous drawing. I will just add and underscore what Professor Allen said, that the among the many really interesting things that you brought for us to think about today, the urging of everyone to vote is perhaps the most important. So I appreciate you mentioning that as well. I know that there are at least a couple of students, in addition to Cameron, who are not originally from Kansas. So I'm really delighted to see those folks here. I know representing California, representing some experiences in New York. So thanks to the two of you very much for this conversation and speaking to us, both out of your expertise and some of your own analysis on the spot. So I very much appreciate it.